Hello, I'm Brian Hansen, the Council's Vice President of Studies and also the host of our weekly podcast, Deep Dish on Global Affairs. And I want to thank you all for tuning in from wherever in the world you're watching us from, and also give a special thanks to today's live studio audience right here in Chicago, all of whom are joining us for what I know will be a fascinating and timely conversation. I'm delighted today to be joined by Fiona Hil. Fiona has a tremendous record in government. She currently is at the Brookings Institution, whereas she is a senior fellow, and she has served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs and National Security from 2017 to 2019. She was also, from 2006 to 2009, National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. And for those of you who are trying to work out the dates, yes, indeed, she served all three of the previous presidents, President Bush, Obama, and Trump. She's written two books. Her most recent book, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, and she is co-author of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. She is, of course, a prolific writer, sought-after expert, particularly knowledgeable of the internal workings of Putin's Russia. And today, we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine and what the future may bring, both there and for our world as a whole. We look forward to engaging members of the audience in the room as well as online when we get to our Q&A period, which will be in about 30 minutes. I also want to mention that this program will be recorded for our podcast, Deep Dish on Global Affairs, where each week I talk with international thought leaders, journalists, and other experts to go beyond the headlines on critical global issues which shape U.S. foreign policy. And if you're not already a subscriber, I encourage you to do so. You can find Deep Dish on the Council's website or on your favorite podcast app. Last thing that I need to do is to remind you that the Council is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit organization. The views shared today are those of those who speak them, and the Council itself does not take views on policy issues. So thank you all for being with us. And Fiona, let's jump right in. And you are one of the people who knows Vladimir Putin best in this country. And in order to set kind of the foundation for our conversation, I was wondering if you could share how he thinks about his role in history, in Russian history and in world history, and how does that self-understanding, how has that shaped the way he's approached this war, both to start it and how he's prosecuted it?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with everyone, both in the studio. It's really nice to see people for a change, and also to everyone online who unfortunately I can't see. That was the beauty of Zoom. You can actually zoom through everybody's faces when they are up there on screen. But anyway, I know that there's people out there. And this is a great way of starting the conversation, because in many respects, this is a war about history. Basically, Vladimir Putin has invaded Ukraine because Ukraine has not comported with his view of Russian history. And in many respects, that puts us all in a predicament, because it's very difficult not just to fight history or fight for history, but also to negotiate history and find a settlement to this conflict on the basis of differing views of history. So that's, where we are. You referenced the book that I co-authored with a colleague from Brookings, Clifford Gaddy, who's actually an economist. Mm-hmm. And so we, an economist and a historian, put our heads together to try to figure out what drives Putin. And one of the drivers was very much Putin as a history man, but as a hobbyist of history. He's a self-taught historian. And Cliff and I picked up on the importance of this to Putin back in 2011 when we were at one of these gatherings that Putin had pulled together in the past under the rubric of the Valdai Discussion Club, where they bring people like all of us. It is a pure propaganda exercise, but it was actually fascinating to be part of it, to see what is the Kremlin, or what was the Kremlin selling us in that particular year. This began back in 2004 and continues to have activities up until the present time. And each year there would be a theme. And on many occasions, Putin, when he was president and then as prime minister and then president again, would speak to all of the group. And on this occasion in 2011, his press secretary, Mr. Peskov, made a big point of talking about how much Putin reads of history. But the rub was, it's only Russian history. And it's his version of Russian history as well. And I think that that explains an awful lot, because Putin clearly sees himself, and this is around the time frame when he was just returning to the presidency, having stepped away for a short period of time to be prime minister. He now sees himself in many respects as the embodiment of the Russian state, very much the state is me. And in my professional capacity, not as an IO, although I was as National Intelligence Officer at these Valdai discussion meetings and had an opportunity to sit next to Putin on a couple of occasions, but in my most recent role as part of the National Security Council, I had met with Putin in the Kremlin, along with National Security Advisor and other teams. And I was really struck, fast forwarding from 2011 and thinking about Putin's view of himself as a figure in history, as the embodiment of the state, and as a self-taught student of Russian history, reading this all the time. You got the whole idea of him kind of going back home after a long, time at the Kremlin and picking up the Reader's Digest version of history and, leafing through the kind of pages and coming up with ideas about it. But at how much interactions were staged in the sense of a historical frame. So that big meeting room that we've all seen him meeting with officials in over the last several months leading up to the war, the one with the big white table, and where you've seen him meeting with members of his team, though he's here and they're 600 feet away, rather than not just 6 feet away, but 600 feet away, it seems, about the size of that table. That room is one of the reception rooms in the Kremlin, and having gone into these reception rooms and looking around, what's interesting is there's not so much portraits. I mean, if you've got the Oval Office and other places like 10 Downing Street or other world leaders, maybe there might be a bust of someone, or there might be some paintings, but there's statues, almost life-size statues of specific czars. And Putin is clearly picking them because he thinks that they somehow embody something that he is trying to convey. And there are several that caught my attention in this room. And I'll just talk about this for a moment, because this is exactly how he sees himself and exactly how he now sees this whole war. It's kind of his battle for his legacy, for him in history. 22 years they're in power. He's been writing essays, he's been kind of presenting this whole idea of a return to Russia, return to the Russian Empire. It's not just the collapse of the Soviet Union as a catastrophe of the 20th century, but it's kind of restoring Russia as a great power, with him right at the center of it. And 3 of the 4 czars that I spotted in this room are very relevant to where we are now. The first is Peter the Great, obviously. The emperor, becomes one of the first self-styled emperors, who defeats the forces of Charles XII of Sweden, when the Swedes had an empire. I suppose some of you might be Swedish, given that we're here in Chicago. It's been a long time since Sweden had an empire. It was once an imperial state. Hard to think about that now, but in any case, Peter the Great defeats the Swedes at the Battle of Poltava, a village in Ukraine, and goes on from there to basically expand out the territory of the Russian Empire, and of course builds up the first Black Sea Fleet, which is on the Sea of Azov, because Russia hasn't at this point annexed Crimea. We'll come to that. And builds up the first Black Sea Fleet for the Russian Navy in the city of Taganrog, which is, again, a kind of a key part of where we are now in all of these battles in Ukraine for the dominance of the Sea of Azov. The second is an empress, Catherine the Great, and of course is the person who annexed Crimea from the Ottoman Empire and extends the Russian Empire into the territories that Putin is now fighting over, Donbass. All of the port cities of the Sea of Azov, Mariupol, Melitopol, Berdyansk, Kherson, and then down to Odessa, which Catherine the Great was one of the founders of Odessa, and brings in the Count Richelieu from France to be the first governor, and builds this up as an international city and of the great port city that we know today. And Putin has an affinity with Catherine the Great. I mean, she kind of bumped off her husband to become empress. She's a German princess, who, basically becomes more Russian than most Russians. Putin himself, of course, speaks German. He has all this kind of affinity, and Catherine, very interestingly, is obviously one of his role models here. And she famously goes from being the queen of the Enlightenment in many respects, writing to Voltaire and various things, to being pretty repressive, going from, she might have been an early funder of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She celebrated intellectuals and then literally puts them all in jail, later on. So, complete flip over the course of her reign. And then one of the third emperor is very troubling, the third Tsar, Nicholas I. And Nicholas I, I think, was selected by Putin because he embodies this whole idea of Russian nationalism that Putin himself is embodying today. One based on the autocrat, the person of the Tsar, or the person of the president in Putin's case, Russian Orthodoxy, the Orthodox Church. And we see how Putin has weaponized the Orthodox Church in the course of this war. And at various points, Putin said that it was a huge mistake of the Bolsheviks to get rid of the Orthodox Church as an instrument of state power. Pretty much summing up what he thinks about the church. It's hardly the spiritual, communal aspects of the church, but very much about the power of this church as an institution and something that can be an instrument of extending power. And then the third element of this nationalist view of Russia that Nicholas I presided over was the people, the narod. And Putin himself, his legitimacy is based on his popularity. And annexing Crimea, for him in 2014, shot his public approval ratings through the roof into the 90%. And, clearly he's relying now on public support for the invasion of Russia. And so, the presidency in Russia, he's not part of a political party. All of his elections are direct in many respects. And the popularity of the people is pretty important for him. And so, his popularity, his ratings, he's watching very closely during this conflict and to see what happens. Now, Nicholas I is known to the rest of us for something quite different, which is losing a war in Crimea. He kept Crimea for the Russian Empire, but he tried to extend out Russia's power into the Black Sea, including into the Ottoman Empire, to claim control over the Christian peoples of the Ottoman Empire, who at that point, already in some degrees of upheaval and struggle against the Ottoman rulers, and hoped to kind of basically take advantage of Ottoman weakness. And instead, he got the Ottoman Empire fighting alongside Britain and France, kind of not dissimilar from what we're seeing today, to roll back Russia. And Nicholas I dies during the Crimean War toward the end of it. He gets sick, and rumour has it that he basically doesn't seek treatment because he knows that the war is being lost. And then the fourth emperor or the Tsar in the room is Alexander II, the great liberator, great emancipator, who has to go into a period of reforms after Nicholas, basically goes through this massive debacle, liberates the serfs and puts Russia on a different track. But at that point, Russia's kind of out of kind of mainstream of European politics because of this great debacle of the Crimean War. Now, I was in that room last in 2019. And, Putin maybe might choose a different set of Tsars to have in the room, at this particular point, who knows. But for me, it was very much emblematic of looking at that, because, nothing is accidental and coincidental in Putin's staging and setting up of the spaces in which he meets people. And so it's very significant, when you ask that question about how does he see this, he sees himself as a Tsar. He sees himself as reclaiming and regaining Russia. And he sees himself as laying claim to a certain view of history. And Ukraine is partly being invaded because Ukraine refused to go along with Vladimir Putin's version of history.
So I think, that's such a powerful set of images about how he sees his peers in the world and his place in the world. And one of the things that's striking about the war is how badly he seems to have miscalculated. Right? And as you talked about, his version of history also included people who overreached and got slapped back. Now, he's a smart person. He's a former intelligence officer. Why do you think he got this so wrong? It seemed that he was going to come in, he thought maybe 3 days or a week. He marches down to Kyiv. He pushes the existing regime out, installs a puppet, somebody he can control in there, and is able to take over the country and do what he wants. This isn't how it came out. Why did he get it so wrong?
I think there are many different reasons. I think one of them has to do with COVID, honestly, because he ended up in more isolation than normal over the last couple of years, just like all of us did. And, I don't think he was a subscriber to your, Zoom programs, which would have been a good idea if he was. So he's sitting there. And is he doing, what I said before, just reading Russian history all the time? He's also in the Kremlin, I joke, on one occasion, maybe he was down there looking through all the old maps, of how the empire used to look. I think there's definitely something to be said about that period of isolation. I mean, we've all been affected by it, but most of us haven't gone and invaded neighbouring countries. But there's definitely, that's definitely a factor. And related to that is that, sense of him, and, when I started with that image of him sitting in that room, with some of his, other people online can't see this room, probably, but there is a huge degree of separation between us sitting here and people in the back of the audience. If you're an analyst and you're an advisor to Putin, you're sitting way back there, it's very hard for you to actually say, Mr. President Vladimir Vladimirovich, I kind of actually think that, you ought to take this into consideration. First of all, if you're an analyst of the kind of analyst that I've been, you're not even going to get in the room. And then, you're going to brief your superiors, the heads of, these various institutions that get to meet with Putin. Are they even going to get, an opportunity to say something? This is highly orchestrated. It's highly orchestrated in our own setting. I have been on many occasions, deeply worried that information that should be given to a president hasn't got there because, the people who decide who gets into the room for these meetings, they don't want to bring in the substance expert because, they've got the right title, or, they actually want to present the information themselves. They want to be briefed up into this, but then they might not know all of the details and they might not get the chance to say everything that they wanted to say. I mean, I've had plenty of those experiences over the time of my career. And then think about that in the Russian context, where Putin is sitting at those tables in the way that he is to make it very clear that he's the guy in charge, that he is the Tsar, and everybody else is a servitor in some respects. And so, if you're not spoken to, asked for your opinion, do you offer it? I mean, that, again, in any situation, as we know, that's also very difficult. So I think there's that part of it as well. The intelligence information was out there, but Putin didn't get it, for a variety of, structural reasons as well as anything else. There's been some changes over in the Kremlin, the people who pull together the information for him that he might, otherwise read. There's always politics in all of this, and things that people want to tell the boss or don't want to tell the boss. We know for a fact now we're seeing that there was a lot of corruption in the military. A lot of the military equipment didn't work. This has been a perpetual problem in the Russian military, and was anybody going to tell Putin that? Clearly they weren't, given the risks of doing that, just basically saying that some of the military actually wasn't as battle ready as you thought. And Putin was very enamoured with the new weaponry and the new systems, particularly the strategic nuclear systems that they have developed, like hypersonic missiles or all of the new fighters and the new tanks and things. And we've seen on other occasions that some of those haven't operated, as they had been hoped. So he was putting a lot of store in the fact that, the military had turned itself around and perhaps wasn't fully informed of some of the inadequacies within the military as part of this. And again, the way that he's structured things makes it difficult for people to bring information, and also very high penalty of getting things wrong. We also know that this war was decided on by Putin in a very, very small group of people. And I think all of you will probably have seen those clips of the meeting he has with his Security Council in the few days before the invasion. It seems that they were pre-recorded some time before because the initial invasion date was some time a bit earlier. But nonetheless, you can see that some of the people there were pretty surprised, including the head of foreign intelligence. He doesn't seem to have been in the mix on this. And it seems that instead, Putin relied on the head of domestic intelligence of the FSB, which is the institution that he comes from, because he clearly thinks of Ukraine as a domestic issue, gets to part of your miscalculation. And so he's listening to the domestic intelligence, who probably don't have the same information as the foreign intelligence people do, for giving him a lay of the land. Then there's also the miscalculation about us and about Ukraine, about how everybody else would react. He thought this was a period of incredible weakness on the part of the United States and Europe and NATO, the EU. He's not wrong, right? I mean, it would have been a fair assessment. But, he then calculates based on all of the churn in NATO over the last several years, the failure of many members to pay the 2% of their GDP towards maintaining the budget, all of the fighting here in the United States about political polarization, the Brexit, the fact that the Poles are on the outs with the European Union, France and Britain, even though they're supposed to have a defence alliance, are fighting over fish and sausages and, all kinds of, stupidity that has kind of emerged. Angela Merkel is leaving in Germany. and there's a new coalition government coming in that's going to be untested. There's an election in France, on and on and on. Our withdrawal from Afghanistan, all he has to do is look around the global scene and see this is the time he's going to act. And it's also because he thinks that Ukraine is in a state of weakness. And this is because he doesn't understand Ukraine. He thinks that Ukraine belongs to Russia. He thinks the Ukrainians are little Russians, as they were termed during the time of the Russian Empire. He doesn't believe in individual agency. He doesn't believe that people exist, this idea of the narod, the people, and the kind of idea of Russian nationalism is just a collective, not a group of individuals, just a kind of an unwashed mass, kind of a block or something. And so he doesn't realize that over the last 30 years, Ukraine has become much more of a civic nationality. There's a sort of a sense of citizenship that's emerged in Ukraine. And although there is a very diverse population in Ukraine, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic, we have Volodymyr Zelensky, who is a Russian-speaking Jew, who is the Ukrainian president, and at one point there was also a Jewish prime minister, which for Putin probably seems antithetical, not because he's anti-Semitic, but because in the Soviet period, Jew was a nationality. I mean, I don't know if any of you here are from the former Soviet Union, but you would have your nationality listed in your passport because of the Soviet Union being a multi-ethnic state, and Jew was a separate nationality. So it wasn't, Volodymyr Zelensky would not have been listed as Ukrainian. And for Putin, he's got this very rigid idea of who's who and how identity is formed on a national level. And so for him, Crimean Tatar, a Pole, a Lithuanian, a Russian speaker, I don't know, an American, a French person living in Ukraine, how could you possibly be Ukrainian? Even though you might feel your affinity and your identity as being Ukrainian. And that's kind of what he completely and utterly underestimated. He also saw that Zelensky was not popular and the Ukrainian government was not popular. Well, that didn't mean that the Ukrainians wanted to be invaded and, annexed and brought into Russia. It just meant that, like in every country, they weren't very thrilled with their government. And Zelensky wasn't necessarily at that point a particularly good peacetime president. There was a lot of hopes had been put into him and expectations were high and he wasn't living up to them. There was a lot of infighting going on. And because they'd had such a success, the Russians, in annexing Crimea without a shot being fired, Putin kind of thought that based on all these assessments, Ukraine was ripe for the picking. And that this would be like a replay of the Soviet forces going into Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Poland, back in the Cold War period, when, the Warsaw Pact was, pretty much held together by Russian force. And that this was more like a policing operation. Domestically, he sends in behind the military, the Russian Guard, the reserve forces who actually do policing activity. And as you said, he thinks it's going to happen in a few days. And all they're going to do is, call upon the military to surrender. And if you think about Poland in the 1980s, General Jaruzelski, Polish military leader, declares martial law because he doesn't want the Soviet forces to move in. And Putin, I think, thinks somebody else in the Ukrainian military might do that because in the Crimea, when it was annexed, a lot of the Ukrainian military and naval forces there just turned over to Russia and, basically kicked out their Ukrainian commanders. On some of the commanders, turned over too. And he just sort of thinks that this is all going to be a replay because he's in a bubble.
Yeah. And turned out to be wildly wrong, of course. And subsequently, he's pulled out of the center of the country and really focused his efforts on the east and then along the south. What do you think his war aims are at this point? We know where the conflict is, but what's his goal at this point?
I think it's still the same. I think the sad fact of the matter from our perspective is that Putin doesn't think that anything's gone wrong. And I know that might sound absolutely bizarre because we can all see that if he declares a victory now, it's very much a Pyrrhic victory. I mean, devastating, obviously for Ukraine, but globally. I mean, this is going to have impacts that we're going to be dealing with for years, for the foreseeable future, and devastating for Russia. But Putin, because he is an operative from the KGB, he knows that any operation doesn't go as planned and you have to have contingencies, you have to adapt to the facts on the ground. He always talks about this. Remember, he's not a military planner. His defense minister is not a military planner either. He was the head of the emergencies ministry and was trained as a civil engineer. They've put generals in charge of it now, but as far as Putin's concerned, he'll find a way to still meet those goals. And those goals are the dismemberment of Ukraine, He's been saying, for years that Ukraine isn't a country. He told George W. Bush in 2008 that Ukraine isn't a real country. Part of it's in Eastern Europe and the other part was given to us, meaning, to Russia and the Russian Empire. He clearly wants to secure control of all of those territories that were expanded into by the Russian Tsars of the past, including this area that Catherine the Great created, New Russia. In fact, he's been even using the title of New Russia that Catherine the Great applied to those lands from the Donbass all the way around the Sea of Azov to Odessa, and actually into Transnistria and Moldova as well. That's now the focus of his military attention, as you said now, and he's been calling it southern Russia as well, not just south of Ukraine. And the dismemberment again of Ukraine, the wiping Ukraine off the map, consolidating hold there, and probably still the intent that Zelensky will go one way or another. And if you think about what happened in Georgia, the country of Georgia in 2008, when Russia invaded to make sure that Georgia could not join NATO, and in response to the fact that Georgia and Ukraine had both applied for NATO membership back in 2008, Mikhail Saakashvili, the president of Georgia at the time, was very much in Putin's crosshairs. Now, it took a while, but in 2013, Saakashvili was voted out of office. And Saakashvili is now sitting in a jail in Tbilisi, having, returned there after being in Ukraine for quite a period of time. It's kind of complicated history here. But this has played directly into Putin's hands because now in Georgia's in a way been somewhat marginalized from some of the kind of international affairs in a way that, it wasn't for a very long period of time. And the ruling party in government there are very cautious towards Russia. And they're trying to now straddle a fine line of sort of being supportive to Ukraine, but not being supportive of Zelensky. And in part, that's because Zelensky has a relationship with Saakashvili. And Saakashvili has become, basically a lightning rod and a flashpoint in Georgian politics. And Putin loves this because, he at various points personalized the conflict with Georgia as a way of, it's easier to deal with things if you personalize them, honestly. I mean, particularly for Putin, who's an operative who targets individuals and tends to personalize things because it makes it easier, to have some kind of offensive, against particularly a person and the people who are associated with them, which is also why he targeted Zelensky. But now these Georgian politics have played exactly into his hands, and George is out of the mix, and a lot of the solidarity that might otherwise from around the region be there for Ukraine has been dented as a result of all of this. And so Putin's probably hoping that something similar will happen to Zelensky. This war will grind on. Zelensky will go from being a national hero to a flashpoint. He's already personalized it, and his view that Zelensky must go, though he's dialed it back for now, he's still got him in his crosshairs.
So, of course, this is a horrific war that we've seen just terrible destruction and loss of life, extraordinary images given technology today. And one of the things that people wonder about is, how does this end? And I am putting together what you're telling about what Putin's idea of himself is, how he is likely interpreting the events that haven't gone well, but he's not we're on the ropes and we need to give up. You think about the other side, where the Ukrainians have had extraordinarily unexpected military success, most recently just clearing the Russians from the second largest city in Ukraine, Kharkiv. Now Mariupol has gone a different direction. But some people are asking questions like, can Ukraine win this war? Putin doesn't seem to be, from your analysis, interested in giving up. So what that sounds like is that we're likely headed into a very long stalemate of this conflict. Is that where you see it going, or do you see a possibility for us to ramp the conflict down, to find an off-ramp?
There is a possibility to, I wouldn't say off-ramp, but to find a way of ending this. It's just going to be extremely difficult. Definitions of win and loss now, I think, have got completely blurred. Any kind of win looks like a loss, including, for Putin. He can very easily spin a win for himself at any point by basically saying he's done all these things to, make Russia safer against a Ukrainian invasion. Ukraine getting hold of a nuclear weapon or weapon of mass destruction. He said all of these, things that will give him a lot of flexibility in a highly controlled domestic environment to be able to spin a win for himself if he chooses to try to stop things at a particular point because he's decided that that's enough. It's just that there doesn't seem to be much sight of that right now, because there's another thing to bear in mind. 2024 is going to be a banner year for elections. It's our election, it's also the Russian election. And technically, the Russian election comes before ours. And Ukraine also will have to have an election for Zelensky. So Putin's got actually quite a lot there that he has to be concerned about. And I mean, one of the reasons that he thought he could act now was to get ahead of all of that. I think he wanted to get ahead of our midterms. He wanted to, act while he had Biden's and everybody else's attention, because I think he wanted us to sue for peace. And he thought that somebody like Biden, who's a transatlanticist, who knows all about NATO, actually knows where Ukraine is, and actually knows something about the history and is very steeped in, kind of international affairs, would be the right person to engage with, as opposed to someone you've got to explain everything to all the time, honestly. I think that that's kind of where he was going. You could see that he got frustrated many times with President Trump because he had to kind of keep explaining things, and Putin doesn't like to do that, even though he loves to be able to spin his own version of events. He wants to have predictability in the person that, he's engaging with there. And he still may be out there, waiting for us to sue for peace, negotiate away Ukraine, and that's a risk. There's a real risk that, Putin actually declares an end to the hostilities, an end to the fighting, and then just, kind of says, okay, well, let's sort of sit down. And we've just heard that the Ukrainians have pulled back from the ongoing negotiations. And, because of all of the commodity prices, the risks of famine, the rise in energy prices, all of the knock-on effects from all of this, the death, destruction uppermost of all of the refugees in all the way across Europe, the frictions that I'm sure he is thinking that will, kind of play out in our politics. He's got a pretty good gamble. I mean, not like akin to the gamble he had at the very beginning of the war, that he can manage his way out of this to something to his best effect. But it will be, in many respects, if that's the case, a horrible stalemate. Because if you're sitting in Ukraine and people then, seem to be selling you out, what's your incentive, to after all of this death and destruction, to basically negotiate on those terms? Now, if you think about other similar conflicts, I mean, World War I, World War II, I mean, obviously the sides exhausted themselves. We were part of those sides as well. And there were these big peace treaties because, there was very definite sides in a war. In this case, we're trying to help Ukraine liberate itself and basically push back an invasion. The Finns had to do that in the Winter War, 1940s, although they didn't have any assistance from us. And they basically negotiated kind of a peace with the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union would leave them alone in exchange for their neutrality, but they lost vast swathes of their territory in Karelia. I don't think the Ukrainians, after all this, are going to be in any mood to lose any of their territory. And Putin is already talking about not just occupying, but annexing additional territories in Kherson, for example, to consolidate the territory around Crimea. And the thing is in here, that can't be acceptable for us either, because what Putin is doing is setting a precedent in international affairs. We basically created all of these international institutions, councils on global affairs included, to basically make sure we don't return to that whole period of the 20th century where countries were taking territory by force and creating worldwide conflagrations. And Putin's basically saying, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to change borders by force. And he's basically pushing back on us things that happened in the past as well. For example, in 2008, we, the United States, unilaterally recognized Kosovo after all of the horrors of the Balkan Wars. And the Russians actually put us on notice then. That's when I was National Intelligence Officer, and said, we're going to use that in the future as a precedent because, you've done this unilaterally. And of course, there are many countries, including in Europe, like Slovakia and Spain, for example, who have not recognized Kosovo because they didn't like the precedent that it set, particularly when it was done unilaterally and then bringing others on. And so Putin is trying to use past precedent mistakes that we and others have made to kind of push things back on us and to make it very difficult for us basically to do something different. And he is basically trolling us in many respects on what he's done in Crimea with recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk, the setting up of these, kind of people's councils in places like Kherson and getting them to hold referenda and then asked to be, incorporated into Russia. He's trying to make it as difficult as possible to have a negotiated settlement in which Ukraine can regain territory. And Putin knows from looking around the world that you can just snarl people up for years in this kind of, if not decades, if not centuries, in territorial disputes. And I think that's kind of what Putin's hoping for. So we have to find a way out of this, be very creative, adaptable, and do, I think, a lot of things more quietly than we are at the moment. Because we often, I would sort of say this, having worked in these things in a public forum, we kind of always have people who walk down a dark alley with a big flashlight on our head saying, we're here and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. Please come mug me now. Whereas, Putin, he says a lot of things, rhetorically that he never means, and also just does a lot of things by stealth and by, covert operation. And, pushes back on us all the things that we've said and done in the past. So we're going to have to be very careful here, but we're also going to have to broaden out the range of countries that we work with as well. Because one thing, you have global in your title, is that we haven't got everybody on board with understanding what's really at stake here. Because what Putin and the Kremlin are doing to Ukraine is setting a precedent for any other country, globally, to think about, well, what could I do to my neighbor? It's not just about China and Taiwan, but it's in any territorial dispute. Putin is basically saying that might makes right, and we can change borders by force, and you can annex territory, and you can think of a whole host of places in the world that could be very deeply affected by this. But Putin is basically telling the rest of the world, this is just about NATO and the United States. It's a proxy war, nothing for you to look at here. So we've got a lot of work to do to basically convince the rest of the world that this is really a pivotal moment and it's going to affect them as well.
So much more to talk about. I wish I could keep asking questions, but I want to bring in the audience. There's a mic there for people in the room. And yes, sir, I will indeed start with you. If you could just say your name and then pose a question.
Avi Porat, I appreciate your describing the goals of Putin with regard to Europe. Many countries that we were expecting to support us, Saudi Arabia, India, other oil companies, are still sitting on the sidelines because they wonder what Putin's objectives are beyond Ukraine and Europe with regard to the Middle East, Iran, etc. What do you think are the Putin objectives and plans outside Ukraine and outside Europe with regard to those parts of the world, like the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, India, etc.?
This is a really great question. And I think, it really gets to the heart of some of the problems I was just talking about at the end, about the way we frame this conflict as well. I don't actually think it's very helpful for us to keep talking about this as a battle of democracy versus autocracy. Because you mentioned India there, which is a democracy, a messy democracy, as our own is. But India doesn't buy that this is also a battle of democracies versus autocracies. And India and many countries like India are really worried, just exactly as you suggest, about what the future relationship is going to be between and among the great powers, which would like to count itself in, but Russia, the United States, and China. So India, for example, was hoping of balancing all three out, looking to Russia to buy defensive weapons because it's worried about China. Remember, India's had this battle over territory with China in the Himalayas, territorial dispute there, and actually there was a hot conflict not so long ago, just in the last year or so, an exchange of fire across the Himalayas in which soldiers were killed on either side, but more on the Indian side. And India's been looking to Russia to offset that. I don't think Russia would rush to India's aid in a conflict with China, but that's, kind of been a factor for India. India's been annoyed with the United States because, we've flirted at the points with Pakistan, and they don't want us to be in a big fight with China that they could be in the middle of. And many other countries, just you're suggesting, are looking at this and thinking, well, hang on a second, I don't see, why this is so relevant for us. And how is this going to affect our interests? Middle East, countries basically saying, well, look, the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. And, you've been in Syria, and there's all kinds of things that you've been doing in our neighborhood. And you're not explaining to us, why you didn't, let's say, step in, why you allowed Saudi Arabia to attack Yemen, for example, and, why you're not doing something here and why you're doing something there. And so why should we then be supporting you on Ukraine? Now, I think, part of the issue on Ukraine is because, as I mentioned before, about this precedent that, really Putin is opening the door here to other countries being able to predate on their neighbours and getting away with it. Also, Ukraine has had an open door to most of these other countries as well. Students, for example, in Kharkiv, from all the way around the world. Ukraine has been one of the biggest providers of grain, as we all now know. I know here sitting in Chicago, of course you knew that. But, also to the World's Food Programme. Ukraine has actually been incredibly generous in terms of not just exporting, grain, but also providing grain. And of course, many of the pilots in relief operations around the world have been Ukrainian. It hasn't just been in, kind of arms smuggling and the things that appears, in film. It's been, actually genuinely engaged in many of these efforts. And so taking out Ukraine as one of the breadbaskets, not just of Europe, but of the world out of the mix, is going to have a lot of serious knock-on effects. Plus, as we already see in the energy field as well. So I think, exactly as you frame it in the question, we have a problem. And we have to think about who are the best interlocutors to be able to engage with countries like India or Indonesia, who wants to invite Russia to the G20, for example, to be able to explain all of this. Obviously, Ukraine itself and Ukrainian leadership, they're trying to do this in the UN General Assembly. But it's a real problem, I think, for all of us in the midst of this war right now, that Putin is, in fact, controlling, in many respects, the narrative and the information space on the conflict from his perspective in many of the countries that you outlined in your question.
Very good. Please, your name and a question.
Dr. Hill, I appreciate you being here. My question has to do with essentially right where you left off. You outlined a number of challenges that you foresee potentially coming up. My question has to do with if the US was developing a doctrine for the future about how we address these challenges. What is that? NATO, for instance, has really shined through with Ukraine. Are the existing international institutions we have, will they be enough for some of the challenges, or should we rethink them? Should we strengthen existing ones? Do we develop new alliances? How do we get to kind of develop the sort of the interlocutors that we need in the future?
Well, I'm really glad that you've asked that, and I think the latter part of your question really gets to the heart of what we need to do, because of course most of our multilateral institutions were developed either at the end of World War II to deal with the aftermath of that particular conflict, or during the Cold War to deal with that particular framing. And of course, President Zelensky has been very critical of the United Nations for obvious reasons. It doesn't look fit for purpose in the current period because of the way that we structured the Security Council. It was the victors, such as they were described, of World War II, the nuclear powers, the 5 permanent nuclear powers. Of course, there have been many more emerged since then. And, with countries like China and Russia and the United States, setting aside the UK and France, all of whom, see themselves as having a right to override, many of the precepts of the United Nations and the United Nations General Assembly, becomes a real problem in a conflict like this of being able to sort of exert a larger influence. When you have veto power, you could just, not bring or allow things to be tabled. And, if you're not, fully engaged in all of the different parts of international law. Look, we have to have a more critical view of ourselves as well. We want to use the International Criminal Court. Some circumstances, but we don't sign on to it. We have the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov and in crisis now, but we haven't ratified the law of the sea, even though actually most of our State Department and actually our Defense Department, everybody I've ever spoken to in the Navy or the Coast Guard actually thinks that we should. But, in Congress and Senate, they don't think so. So we have a lot of problems ourselves in, how we address this. And I think that, if we were able to, given the politicization of so many things, we ought to be having, an honest discussion with ourselves about the need to, exactly as you suggest here, refurbish some of the institutions that we, ourselves are being part of, and we were the creators of in the early stages. And this conflict in Ukraine, like many other conflicts, look, I could say the same about what's going on in Yemen and Syria, and many other places as well, really reveals the inadequacy of many of the institutions that we have. Now, do we need to start creating new ones? Perhaps, the first order is all the things that we're constantly talking about, how we refit for purpose the existing ones. I do worry, about NATO, for example, because although, as you said, NATO's got a new zest for life. It's a new zest for an old life. I mean, we're dealing with Russia or the former Soviet Union. And NATO, since 2010, had been in the midst of, in fact, Ivo Dalda, the president of the council, in his role as ambassador to NATO and previous lives of thinking about this, was part of the whole argument about how do you find a new agenda for NATO that's not just, confined to the same old, same old. How does NATO deal with, so many of the crises that are existential, but are things like pandemics and climate change and the migration and all the other issues that are destabilizing. I think perhaps migration being the result of larger wars and climate migration, etc. But how is NATO going to position itself to build on itself as a platform of an alliance and thinking about security in different kinds of ways, more human security, not just old style security. But now we're right back at that again. So does that mean an end of that thinking? For example. And, I think, yes, this has revitalized NATO, but it really needs, nonetheless, for NATO to be thinking more broadly. One of the issues is also China thinking ahead and how China will now react to multinationalism and multilateralism and institutions. Because NATO, in the run-up to this war, of course, was starting to think about how does it deal with China and the Chinese threat in the cyber domain, or a China that's more active politically in Europe and elsewhere, not just as an economic player. And perhaps it's then no coincidence that China decides to be very critical of NATO in that joint statement of President Xi and President Putin on the margins of the Beijing Olympics. I was personally quite surprised that President Xi decided to run, straight into the whole debate about European security. But then, from his perspective, I suppose he thought that NATO was doing the same thing with AUKUS, although he probably then missed that the French were pretty pissed off about this whole thing of the Australia, US, UK submarine deal. But the fact that France and Great Britain, and along with Canada and the United States, are players in the Asia-Pacific region. He didn't like the new Indo-Pacific strategy, for example. So I'm sure that she thought that this is all fair game as well. But it also then reveals that even for a regionally based institution like NATO or the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, everything is global. And so we're going to have to take a much more global perspective and a much more nuanced perspective of where we're headed in the future. So I think your question there is exactly the right one. I'm not sure that we have answers at this particular moment, but that's why we have fora like this to try to at least start to sketch out and frame some of them.
Certainly defining the right questions is a key.
Yes, it's a
Finding
key.
good
I mean, that's what we
answers,
do
right?
at think tanks. Then we kind of
Exactly.
flounder around a little bit trying to find the ultimate answer. But I'm sure we'll honestly get there in the end. It's just that it's going to take some time and some really critical thinking and some hard looks at what we've been doing ourselves.
Yeah, like the optimism. Yeah, please name and question.
My name's Aaron Maslyansky, and great to be here. Thank you for being here, Dr. Hill. My question relates to Sweden and Finland coming into NATO. How do you think Russia is going to react? And if they react and attack them prior to them being part of NATO, do you think that the alliance will come to their defense?
Well, I mean, we already have lots of defensive arrangements with Sweden and Finland, just to be clear, including, bilaterally and, collectively in the sort of Scandinavian realm with the United States. So, I mean, yes, we would come to the defense that we already have in many, respects. With Sweden and Finland, when there's been incidents of incursions into airspace and other incidents. I mean, basically, Sweden and Finland have been incredibly close partners to NATO throughout this whole time frame. I mean, they've made it very clear about why they didn't want to join. I mean, they're both countries that put a lot of store in their own self-defense, their defensive capabilities. I mean, they both have citizens who are highly engaged in their defense, especially the Finns, given their experience. They're very much embedded in all kinds of defensive exercises with all of their neighbours. I mean, they're kind of the Nordics, Baltic, air power pooling and sharing systems, as well as lots of bilateral deals here. But a lot of this is about the communication of why they're joining, which the Finnish president has been very focused on. When he basically said that Putin needs to look in the mirror about the reason for Finland and Sweden joining. And this is making a very important statement that gets back to some of the things I was talking about before. Putin and the people around him tend to mirror image. So they assume that NATO is just about the United States and this is just a fake alliance. And, a lot of our debates over defence spending didn't certainly help over the last several years. I think that just convinced him all the more that when we were arguing with Germans in particular about 2% of GDP, that this was just proving that, the NATO was all the US centred organisation. And when Russians talk about expansion, it's almost as if there's some kind of standalone entity there that's just kind of going out there and bringing countries in, by force almost, which is exactly what the Warsaw Treaty Organization was back in the Cold War. And in many respects, the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which has just been meeting, Russia's organization, is right now. I mean, basically, these are all countries that Russia's kind of given not much agency to in terms of being members of this or having Russian bases on their territory, like in the case of Armenia. And basically, Russia thinks the United States is exactly in the same position. And what Finland and Sweden's membership shows is absolutely not. These are countries that could have entered NATO at any point over all the last decades, notwithstanding, Finland's declarations of neutrality as part of its, agreements with the Soviet Union. It could have made a choice in an early period. Look, Austria is now rethinking its non-alignment and, basically neutrality, and so is Ireland. And I'm not saying that they're, heading off towards NATO, but Putin has created such a situation now where countries that have been absolutely studiously non-aligned and neutral are now rethinking. And the Irish are rethinking because the Russian Navy showed up in their territorial waters and their economic zone as part of their planning for this invasion. And Ireland doesn't even have a coast guard. It has like 4 ships that it usually uses to interdict smugglers. And it doesn't have an air force. It basically has a few training planes to take part in international operations. And it was Irish fishermen on their trawlers that showed off the Russian Navy. And then the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs accused the Irish of aggression. And so basically the Irish have been reassessing now, where they stand, and clearly thinking, differently about the price of neutrality. And so it's all the communication about this. Again, as I said earlier, the first movers to enter NATO were all the countries that had been invaded by supposedly, their own military partner in the Warsaw Treaty Organization. And this, then gets more into this message to Russia. Now, Putin seems to be being a bit more careful so far on what he said about Finland, that Russia's not a threat and to Finland and, being a bit more cautious. But I think, we will have to watch very closely. And the Finns and the Swedes have clearly factored this in because they've had this debate for years about whether they wanted to join NATO. But the fact that they should be sending a very strong signal. But I think the Finns and the Swedes should be out on the road telling everybody else, not just in Europe, but China and others about why they're doing this as well.
So Fiona Hill, I want to say thank you for a fascinating conversation.
Did we cut it off? I'm sorry, we had some other questions there.
Really, it's been terrific. And as you point out and made the case quite strongly, we're living in a world historical moment in which there is a tremendous amount at stake, not only in this conflict, but where the world as a whole is heading. So I really appreciate you taking time to help us understand that even better. And I want to thank you in the room for being here and coming in person to see this event. I want to thank you online for tuning in as well. This program will be available both online through our YouTube channel if you want to share it with others, as well as through Deep Dish on Global Affairs, where you can find either on our website or wherever you listen to podcasts. So I look forward to having all of you online and in the room joining us our next event. And please join me one last time in thanking Fiona Hill for a fascinating talk.